Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I have rarely seen the enthusiasm for getting me to do a reaction to a video that I have seen about this one. I've been getting emails from people, comments on Patreon and messages and a bunch of comments here on YouTube asking me to check out the channel Canadiana. And the video is called How the American Civil War Made Canada. Now, Canada is one of the countries outside the United States where we have the greatest number of viewers. So it's nice to be able to dive into some Canadian history. I've done a few videos here and there, including my video about the Royal Newfoundland Regiment from Beaumont-Hamel over in France. So I'm always glad to be able to tell the story of Canadians, even if it relates in some way to the American experience. So we're going to take a look at this one today. The link is in the description to the original content. I'm assuming their channel must be about Canadian history. They got about 50,000 subscribers. So if we can shine a light and maybe send a few more subs their way, that is fantastic. I want to give a shout out to The Confessor. That's the only name I have for you. No address or anything. And then also Per Nordstrand over in Sweden. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
This is the earliest known photograph of Niagara Falls.
Oh, wow. Now, here's what's crazy. This is not what Niagara Falls will look like today, because Niagara Falls is eroding at a pretty substantial rate. And so it moves like, I think, a couple of inches a year. And maybe even more than that. Somebody will have to look it up and tell me in the description below. But it's a pretty significant amount. So it definitely has changed a lot since this photo would have been taken.
It was taken from the Canadian side around 1840.
Wow.
Back before all the wax museums and casinos, when this world wonder was untouched by the sightseeing throngs we know today.
I wouldn't say it was untouched by sightseeing throngs, because it was a pretty common destination even back then for people to visit. It just didn't have all the commercialization it does today.
For more than 200 years, Canadians and Americans have been gazing out at each other across this spectacular natural border. Today, they do so as friends. But not long after that photo was taken, dread loomed over these waters. Through the mist and beyond the horizon, Canadians saw trouble coming. The United States were about to be torn apart. Blood would flow, and cities would burn, as Americans turned against Americans, while the freedom of millions hung in the balance, and tens of thousands of Canadians would be a part of it all.
Yeah, pretty cool animation there to start, and I'll wait until he gets a little further into the intro, but I do want to talk a little bit about what was going on in terms of foreign policy during all of this, because the American Civil War did very much have a real element of danger that it would spill over into places like Canada and Mexico.
The U.S. Civil War was the biggest war this continent has ever seen.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just an American affair. Its reach would extend across this border. Thousands of Canadians would rush south to take up arms, while Canadian cities would be filled with secret agents and intrigue. And as the ashes cooled, a new nation would be forged. This is the Canadian story of the American Civil War. This is Canadiana.
Pretty cool production value so far on this channel. I like it a lot.
Welcome to Chatham. It's a relatively quiet city in the middle of southern Ontario. Not exactly the first place that leaps to mind when you think of the bloodiest war in American history. But 2 centuries ago, this was one of the most passionately anti-slavery towns on earth. Chatham, Ontario would help ignite the American Civil War. In the middle of the 1800s, millions of people were still enslaved in the southern United States. Tens of thousands of them were risking their lives to escape along the Underground Railroad.
So a couple of things to think about looking at this map. So first of all, I live right up in here. This is actually Mosquito Lake right there, that long lake, which is really visible from planes when you're flying in the Cleveland area. And just south of that's where I grew up. And, right here, the panhandle of West Virginia, which is, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 miles from where I live, that was Virginia at the time. That was a slave state. And so that's how far north. I mean, you're talking almost as far north as New York City at that point. And of course, Missouri over in the west, same thing. I'm sure he's going to talk about it, but you had the Underground Railroad, which was huge, and here in Northeast Ohio there were a lot of stops on the Underground Railroad, which was basically this network of hiding places that were used to help allow escaped and formerly enslaved people to get to freedom. But with the Fugitive Slave Act, that meant that even if someone was able to escape slavery and get into the North, into a free state, they weren't safe, because those free states, the authorities, the legal authorities, were required by law to help those slave owners regain their property. And so at that point, the mission became get them to Canada, because Canada did not have slavery, and you couldn't, as an American, you didn't have authority to be able to go into Canada and regain your slaves. So that was kind of the place you were going. And so you could see a place like Ohio or Pennsylvania or Western New York or Eastern Michigan, how important those places come, because you can get to Ontario.
Many of them heading north to the Canadian colonies, where slavery had been banned. Chatham was one of the most important stops at the end of that dangerous journey. A full third of the people who lived here were black.
Really?
Many of them new arrivals.
Wow.
Who fled the U.S., including Marianne Schat and Osborne Perry Anderson. Schat was a publisher, the first black woman in North American history to run her own newspaper.
That's awesome, and good for her. And you can see she's got a relatively light complexion, and like a lot of enslaved people, she probably had a significant portion of white ancestry. You had a lot of slave owners having children. Very famously, people talk about Thomas Jefferson, but there was a lot of that. And my own third great grandmother was most likely the product of a relationship between her owner and her mother.
Provincial Freeman was a beacon of hope, fighting racism on both sides of the border and championing the end of slavery. Anderson worked for the paper too, selling subscriptions and printing copies on his printing press,
Cool.
using paper and ink to fight for the freedom of millions. The Provincial Freeman helped Chatham earn its reputation as a stronghold of anti-slavery activity. It's been said that nowhere on earth was more hated by slaveholders than the Canadian colonies. And that reputation would soon attract a wildly passionate American abolitionist, the legendary John Brown. Brown was a crusader for freedom, a fanatically religious man who believed he was a holy warrior appointed by God to end slavery. His supporters included major figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. He'd already served as a station master, running a safe house on the Underground Railroad, and waged a bloody guerrilla campaign against slaveholders in Kansas. Now,
and for those who aren't familiar with the story
step.
of what we call Bleeding Kansas, so the entire early history of the United States is all about the issue. Most prominent issues are financial issues and the issue of slavery and the balance of power between northern and southern states when it comes to those things. And Long story short, what ends up happening is that they determine that Kansas will get to decide for itself whether or not it wants to be a free state or a slave state, which hadn't really been done before with territories. And so you start having all of these people flooding in from those competing interests, trying to tip the balance in favor of their side. Why? Because when Kansas becomes a state, that's 2 new senators, as well as some new congressmen who are going to be representing either a free state or a slave state. So it's all kind of in that. And so Kansas becomes kind of a microcosm of the country, and it becomes a early spot where violence happens, and it's kind of a preview of the Civil War.
John Brown wanted to spark a second American Revolution, a civil war that would end slavery once and for all. And to do it, he came here to Chatham, to the First Baptist Church. Brown invited local residents to a series of secret meetings. He preached his dream of an armed insurrection and asked the delegates to approve
It's a little like Hugh Jackman there.
a new and improved U.S. Constitution for the free, reborn country he hoped to build out of the ashes. Osborne Perry Anderson attended those meetings, serving as secretary. He signed the new Constitution, and then he headed south to join John Brown's war. Their plan was so daring and audacious, it bordered on madness. On an autumn night in 1859, Brown's tiny army of about 17 men launched a raid on the town of Harper's Ferry, where the American government kept a massive stockpile of weapons. They seized the arsenal and began taking hostages, confident that a wave of enslaved people and allies would rise up and join them, and the revolution would begin.
Yep. And this was not the first time something like this had happened.
Given a particularly high-profile hostage target, George Washington's great-grandnephew.
Thought I paused it, but I guess not. Yeah, you had Nat Turner's rebellion, for example, which was Nat Turner was himself enslaved. And so this is one of the few times you have one of these things started by a white American from the North, but not the first time that someone had attempted to inspire such an uprising.
The high-profile hostage target, George Washington's great-grandnephew. The Canadian and a few other raiders stormed his mansion, freed the people he enslaved, and armed those willing to join their fight. In the process, they confiscated 3 of the man's most prized possessions, passed down to him from the president: George Washington's famous sword and a pair of pistols that had once belonged to the revolutionary hero Lafayette. The eminent slaveholder was forced to hand them all over to the black revolutionary from Chatham. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. News of the raid soon spread, along with rumors that Anderson was the group's leader. It wasn't long before 1,500 militiamen arrived, along with federal troops led by Robert E. Lee, who would soon become the Confederacy's most famous Civil War general. The revolutionaries were outnumbered, besieged for days on end, and eventually overrun. Nearly all the raiders who hadn't already been killed were captured and sentenced to death, including John Brown. Anderson was one of the few who escaped, using his contacts on the Underground Railroad to slip out of the country and make a harrowing journey back here to Chatham. Then he set to work spreading the story of Harper's Ferry far and wide, the only black raider who survived to tell the tale.
I did not know that.
And while John Brown was hanged just weeks after his failed revolution, he used that time to tell the story too. He wrote hundreds of letters, gave interviews to the press, and rallied support for the fight against slavery.
That's an important thing to note here, the timeline, right? This is just weeks after the events unfold, and this is how it used to typically be. You know, these days, the United States is one of the few Western nations that still even does executions, but we don't do that many, and very often people are on death row for 20, even 30 years, depending on the state. Some states are a little quicker than others just because of the appeals process. I've mentioned it before, but I had a childhood friend who was murdered at the age of 12. here in our area. I was in 1985, and one of his killers is still on death row. I mean, we're talking 1985. He was like 19, this killer, when he did it, and now he's, in his 50s. But my grandpa's, and I think I've shared this story before, my grandfather's great uncle was murdered in 1918 down in Kentucky by a guy that had gotten in trouble for dodging the draft, and he came back and he murdered 4 people who he felt were responsible for it, and one of them was my grandpa's great uncle. The guy was, there was a whole army of eyewitnesses to this event because he came right down to their workplace and did it in front of everybody. So there was no doubt of his guilt. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed in less than a month after the event took place. Different time.
A true martyr to the cause. The raid on Harper's Ferry divided the United States even further than it already was. Pro-slavery Southerners saw it as a sign it was time to form their own country, while abolitionists saw it as a heroic act, an urgent reminder that slavery needed to end now. It was less than a year later that Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States. And in the weeks and months that followed, the southern states all seceded from the Union, declaring themselves to be a new country, the Confederate States of America.
So, really, really quickly, it's important to point out here that as everybody points to Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860 as the catalyst for the Civil War, it was like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 kicks off World War I. It was not an isolated event that triggered all of it. It was the lighting of a fuse for an explosive situation that had been brewing for a while, right? So it was the event that set it off, but the stockpile of explosive material had been building for decades at that point. That was just the event. John Brown's raid is part of that stockpiling of gunpowder, so to speak, that Lincoln's election sets off.
And with that, the Civil War began. The Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war. 2 massive armies tore into each other outside Washington, D.C. But it wasn't just Americans fighting that day. There were Canadians on the battlefield too, including a woman from the Maritimes who joined the Union Army in disguise. Sarah Emma Edmonds grew up on a farm in New Brunswick. When she was just 17 years old, her father tried to marry her off to a man she'd never met who was nearly twice her age. That's how she ended up here in St. John.
She's like, I'm out. And this was a common thing. There are documented at least dozens that we know of, and probably many more we don't know of women who disguised themselves as men and served in the ranks during the war.
Running away from home to live life on her own terms. And it's why she first decided to disguise herself as a man. Edmonds borrowed some clothes from a friend, cut her hair, darkened her skin a bit, and even had surgery to remove a mole from her face.
Wow.
She adopted a new identity, becoming a traveling Bible salesman named Franklin Thompson.
That's awesome.
By the time the Civil War broke out, she was living in the United States. And while she would always consider herself a Canadian, she hid that fact so she could join the Union Army and fight for what she called a just cause.
So I'm curious to know in this situation now, given our much more modern understanding of this stuff, I don't want to jump to the conclusion that this was like a trans person. This was someone who was wanting to identify as a man, or was it just that she was hiding her identity? But I'm sure, no doubt, there were situations where you did have that in either case. But I'm curious to know more about the story. All right, so once I went and did a little reading about Sarah Edmondson on the American Battlefield Trust site, I realized I was familiar with her story. I just didn't realize she had Canadian origins. And I'm sure he'll probably talk about this, but she did end up becoming the only woman who was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the fraternal organization for veterans of the war. And she received a pension as a veteran of the war. So pretty cool.
When she enlisted, they didn't notice she was a woman. They only cared that she could see, hear, had a trigger finger to fire with, and at least 2 teeth so she could rip open cartridges of gunpowder. And so Edmonds became one of more than 500 women who fought in the war disguised as men. She was assigned the job of field nurse, still typically a man's job back then, and sent off to join the fight. She soon found herself at Bull Run, in the thick of the war's first big battle. She rushed through the smoke and roar of artillery, musket balls hissing all around her as she rescued wounded men and gave comfort to the dying. In a nearby church, used as a field hospital, Edmonds rushed to stitch men back together and bandage their wounds, held some down while their limbs were sawn off. The battle was lost, the Union retreated, but Edmonds stayed behind.
So I want to point out real quick, and we've talked about this before as well, this concept of men being wide awake and held down while their limbs were sawed off very, very rarely happened in the American Civil War. Most of the records, if you look at them, the vast majority of surgeries like that where you're having amputations done were done under some form of anesthesia.
Tending to her patients as long as she could before she fled. She barely escaped. During the war, Edmonds would fight on the front lines, ride dangerous missions as a messenger, and she wasn't alone. There were other Canadians fighting for the North all through the war, like Edward P. Doherty, who grew up near Drummondville and signed up just days after the first call for troops was sent out. He was captured at Bull Run by the Confederates, but made a daring escape. Calixa Lavallee was a musician from Quebec who fought at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest of the entire war.
Bloodiest single day of the war. It wasn't the bloodiest battle. The bloodiest battle was Gettysburg, followed by Chickamauga.
He would go on to write the music for O Canada. And Chatham Anderson fought too. Once the Union Army began accepting black soldiers, he worked as a recruiter, convincing black Canadians to enlist, and then joined up himself, eager.
It's kind of cool to think about the fact that you had Canadians coming across the border to enlist, because then you'll have the reverse happen in the early stages of the First World War, where you'll have Americans going across the border to enlist in the Canadian Army.
The fight in the war he had helped start. There wasn't a major battlefield in the entire Civil War where Canadians didn't fight. Tens of thousands of them joined the Union Army, willing to risk their lives in the struggle against the Confederacy and slavery. But by doing it, Edmonds, Anderson, and all the others were breaking the law.
And again, I think her name was Edmondson, not Edmonds. Let me take a look and double check that. No, it is Edmonds. I don't know why I was thinking it was Edmondson. I got that wrong. My bad. Let's continue.
Because while you might assume the Canadian colonies would support the North during the war, that's not what happened at all. Today, Canada and the United States are the best of friends. They share the longest border on the planet.
Yeah?
Nearly 9,000 kilometers across land and sea. And both nations are proud to point out that this is the longest undefended border too. But 2 centuries ago, things were very different. There were times when Canada and the United States were mortal enemies. Here in St. John, you'll find a giant physical reminder of just how bad things could get. This Martello Tower is just one of a whole series built across the eastern half of our country. Like here in Halifax and Kingston and Quebec City. They were built.
So just real quick, one more time on the whole Sarah Edmonds thing. She was born Edmondson. She changed her name as part of her escaping. But so this is where I think a good spot to stop and talk about some other things that are going on in terms of foreign relations here. When Abraham Lincoln becomes president, he's got on his cabinet, in particular, a couple of really forceful personalities in Salmon P. Chase, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, and William Seward, who is Secretary of State. And these were men who both fully expected that they were going to be the Republican nominee in 1860. Lincoln kind of becomes the compromise candidate between the folks supporting some of these others. And then he puts them on his cabinet. And that whole story is told in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, which is phenomenal, by the way. One of the best history books I've ever read. And part of that book is the basis for the movie Lincoln. But one of the things that his cabinet is pressing for early on, in particular, I think Seward and maybe Chase were on board with this, was the idea of getting involved in a foreign war to unite North and South against another enemy. You know, the whole enemy of my enemy is my friend concept. If we could focus on a foreign war, go to war with Spain, go to war with Mexico, go to war with France, go to war with the UK and with Canada, which is part of the UK, that will allow the United States to not go to war with itself. And they really did push for this, especially because the French were getting involved in Mexico. And so you have this violation. What Americans saw as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically Europe, you need to stay out of North and South America. So there was a real push for that. And so Canadians are going to get sucked into that possibility of war with the United States as a way of the United States keeping its own integrity.
Built at different times over the course of many decades, but with one big fear in mind, the fear of an American invasion, a fear that came true more than once.
Yeah.
It went all the way back to the American Revolution.
Yep.
When the rebellious colonies of the United States overthrew British rule, they also attacked the loyal British colonies to the north, the Canadian ones. They besieged Quebec City and occupied Montreal. The relationship didn't get off to a good start.
And this is one of the early places where Benedict Arnold is going to make a name for himself, is in the invasion of Canada.
And it didn't end there. The Americans launched an even bigger invasion during the War of 1812. Then there were the border skirmishes of the Patriot War, with Americans supporting Canadian rebels. And the Oregon Crisis, when the US tried to annex the entire Pacific Northwest, and got a lot of it. Heck, in the months before John Brown's raid, war had nearly broken out over a barnyard animal. When an American...
There's a whole oversimplified video about that. Did a reaction if you want to check it out. The Pig War.
Killed a Canadian pig on an island off the coast of BC. It sparked a tense standoff involving thousands of troops, both sides claiming the island for themselves in what became known as the Pig War.
That's a cool fort.
Many Americans thought those tensions would inevitably end with the Canadian colonies joining the United States. Americans like this man, William Seward, one of the most powerful politicians in the U.S.
And listen, having read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book a couple of times, I am a big fan of William Seward. He doesn't start out real good in the story of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, but by the end, man, I like him a lot. I really do.
Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. Seward talked openly about his dream of a United States that covered the entire continent.
Yep.
Manifest Destiny. And even some...
Manifest Destiny, there were those who believed that included Canada and Mexico and the whole continent, but for the most part, it was about spreading to the west. And largely by the time of the American Civil War, that dream had been realized because the U.S. pretty much laid claim to everything all the way to the Pacific. But there were those who felt that way. And there was another fear as well, which was that if the Civil War ended in a Confederate victory, that could mean the potential that the Confederacy would then look to spread south. Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, places like that, and they would spread slavery to those places as well.
Influential Canadians agreed, signing a manifesto asking to be taken over.
Kind of like Texas.
As the Civil War loomed, Seward had tried to find an excuse to start a war with the Canadian colonies, hoping to unite Northerners and Southerners against a common enemy.
I didn't know he was going to talk about that, or I wouldn't have said anything.
While American newspapers called for an invasion. They figured if the South left the United States, the Canadian colonies would make a nice replacement. And when the Civil War started, those tensions only grew higher. The British were officially neutral, refusing to take sides, which meant the Canadian colonies were neutral too. The Canadian authorities did everything they could to stay out of the war, but the Union didn't always respect that decision. Some northern recruiters snuck across the border to kidnap Canadians and force them into the Union Army. There are stories of sex workers drugging drinks to knock men out before dragging them back south, where those Canadians would suddenly find themselves fighting for the North. And when the Union boarded a British ship to arrest Confederate diplomats on their way to meetings in England, it nearly sparked the war William Seward had been after.
And that really is truly, a lot of people talk about, well, there was a real threat of British intervention in the war. And I think by the time you get to 1863 and say the Battle of Gettysburg, that threat has passed. But the closest I think that the U.S. comes to going to war with the British is over the Trent Affair, when they grab these diplomats and basically end up having to back down and allow them to go ahead and proceed. And it's really one of the moments that you see the real skill of Abraham Lincoln as a foreign diplomat as well, because he doesn't have a lot of experience in that area, and he largely relies on Seward, who's his Secretary of State, to do that. But Seward probably would have mishandled it if it hadn't been for the steadying hand of Lincoln, because Seward was going to be pretty hard in his reply and his dealing with the British over this matter, and he might have more likely sparked a war, which is maybe what he wanted. But Lincoln kind of backed him down and kind of softened some of the language in their response.
Something had to be done. The Canadian colonies needed reinforcements to protect the border and settle things down. They would come from Britain, and they would arrive in spectacular style. The Great Eastern was the biggest ship in the world, bigger even than the biblical dimensions of Noah's Ark, and so famous that it's appeared in a Jules Verne novel and a song by Sting. As it steamed out of Liverpool, it was carrying twice as many people as any ship had ever carried before. More than 2,000 soldiers were on board,
wow,
plus families and crew, all bound for Canada in a hurry. The captain pushed the ship as fast as it would go, refusing to slow down even in thick fog, barely dodging icebergs, nearly plowing.
2,000 people on a ship dodging icebergs seems eerily foreshadowing there.
Right into another big ship when it reached the coast of Newfoundland.
Did he just say Newfoundland? I've never heard anybody pronounce it that way before. Is that how Canadians say it? I've always kind of said Newfoundland. Interesting.
Thankfully, the Great Eastern made it across the ocean in one piece, smashing the record for the quickest crossing ever. It was packed so full of soldiers that when it docked here at Quebec City, it took 2 days to ferry them all ashore.
Kind of a cool little animation they did there with putting the image of the ship over the real video. Whoever's their video production person, doing a great job.
It was a huge public event. The mayor himself welcomed the crew. The captain gave interviews to the press. And sightseers came from as far away as Toronto. And all that spectacle had a purpose: to drive home one big message to the Americans.
Canada is defended.
All across the Canadian colonies, preparations for war were underway. Militias were expanded. Fortresses were upgraded. Schools were turned into barracks. In Toronto, students formed rifle corps. In Montreal, shops closed early so employees could drill, and railway facilities were turned into weapons factories.
Interesting.
Thousands of additional soldiers poured in from Britain, along with 50,000 guns and millions of rounds of ammunition.
I need to know where these forts are that they're showing, because there's definitely some stuff in Canada I apparently need to go see, because they look really, really epic.
Even some of the old Martello towers were reinforced, given new artillery, ready to face down yet another American invasion. And so, when a meteor streaked across the sky above Niagara Falls that winter, people didn't see it as a shining beacon of friendship between nations. They saw it as an omen of an impending Canadian-American war. And thanks to some troublemaking pirates, that war would very nearly happen.
Always the pirates. This is going to be the St. Albans raid.
In part 2, we'll meet the Canadians who supported the Confederacy.
I didn't know there was going to be a part 2 to this, so I guess we know what we're going to be doing once it comes out. I think this only came out like a week ago, so there may not be the part 2 yet, but I'll check that out. All right, so they are going to have a part 2. It's not out yet, but we'll definitely do that when it comes. I want to give a shout out to Daly in Fort Saskatchewan and Garrett in Port Perry, both in Canada. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. If you want to sign up to support the channel through Patreon, it's a huge help. The link is in the description of every single video. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you again soon.